In February 2002, a family of 5 would disappear from their West London home in a case that would shock the British public. Life was going well for Amarjit Chohan. He had a hugely successful import and export company, he had a property portfolio, and most importantly, he had a family after himself and his partner Nancy had welcomed 2 young sons into the world. But although Amarjit, known to friends as Neil, didn't have any known enemies, with friends like his, I really don't think that you would need them. This is a story of greed, deception, betrayal, and ultimately heartbreak. A game of cat and mouse between the perpetrators and the police, multiple gruesome seaside discoveries, and a final action for Amarjit Chohan that would close the net on the men responsible. This is the Chohan family murders.
But before we get into the full story, we just want to send our regards to the Chohan family, who must have been dealing with one of the worst moments of their entire lives. In this episode, we will detail what happened to the family as sensitively as we possibly can. But remember, we are going to be talking about the untimely passing, both of a couple, a maternal grandmother, and also 2 very young children. And as we say, our thoughts very much go out to their memory. So to start the story off, why don't we tell you a little bit more about the Chohan family, and more specifically, the father, Neil.
So Amarjit Chohan, known as Neil, how we refer to him in this video, was born on the 5th of March 1957 in India, but he actually moved over to the UK in the 70s. He originally married a woman named Kuldeep, and they lived together in West London while Neil built up his business, Jumbo Freight Services. This was a company that imported fruit and vegetables, and it would grow to be hugely successful, turning over millions per year. However, Neil's road to success definitely didn't come without its hiccups, and in 1996, he's actually sentenced to 18 months in prison for charges relating to fraud and tax evasion. And it was once inside Ford Prison in West Sussex that he actually met a few friends. Most of them were gentlemen around his age that were in there, and one of them was a man named Kenneth Regan. Now, he was a convicted substance dealer, but he was very much like Neil, looking to get his head down, serve his time, and get out of prison. And therefore, himself and Neil developed a little bit of a bond, and this bond could be a deadly one, but we will get on to Kenneth Regan in a minute. In the meantime, Neil's time in prison was pretty straightforward. However, life on the outside wasn't exactly plain sailing. He actually split from his wife while he was carrying out his prison sentence, but after being released from prison, he was determined not to let it hold him back. He wanted to rebuild his life. He wanted to invest into his company and build it to be even bigger than he had before, and that's exactly what he did, because the company went from strength to strength, and upon his release, he met his wife Nancy, and the 2 would share 2 sons together, Devinder and Ravinder. And by 2003, Neil was on the verge of selling his company for millions, and it was actually an old friend, Kenneth Regan, who was facilitating the sale. He had turned up looking for work just a few months earlier, and wanting to help out an old friend, Neil Chohan gave the former substance dealer a job. He definitely believed that Kenneth Regan needed a chance to make money legitimately without delving into the criminal world, and he felt like he could give Kenneth Regan that opportunity to be able to better himself, which is why he employed him as a driver for his firm in West London. But before I go about telling you what a fatal decision this would be, why don't we learn a little bit more about the man in question, Kenneth Regan?
Yeah, so you might be asking, how does a delivery driver get wound up in a multi-million-pound business deal? I didn't understand it at the start, and I don't really still understand it now, if I'm being completely honest with you. But the thing is that Kenneth Regan always rated himself as a bit of a criminal mastermind, a bit of a playboy. He was a man about town. He liked splashing his cash. He liked making out that he was the big man on campus, and he loved showing people how much money he actually had. So let me tell you a little bit more about him. He was born in 1953, which made him roughly about 50 years old at the time that we're talking about right now. And before he was nicked, he was actually given a nickname. The nickname was Captain Cash, which very much indicates the type of personality he actually was.
Captain Cash is quite a cool nickname. By the way. I'm just putting it out there now, discussed in case, but Captain Cash is a pretty cool nickname.
And very much like Jesse from Breaking Bad, Captain Cook, it kind of works, you know what I mean? Like, we're kind of in that world. I understand what he was doing. Maybe this was pre-Breaking Bad, but it still was a good nickname. I give him that, absolutely. Awful man, did awful things, Good nickname.
Yeah.
Right, before we get into that, have you had any trouble sleeping recently? Well, if you have, why don't you check out Emma mattresses? I have got a brand new Emma mattress in my new place. It is the Emma Hybrid Thermosync mattress, and I need it because I'm a very warm sleeper, and this helps me sleep with perfect temperature, and that's thanks to the Thermosync thermal regulation, which basically dissipates all of the heat so you can get a very cool and comfortable night's sleep. And I have had the best night's sleep I have had in years on this one. It is fitted perfectly into my new place, and because it's new year, new me, this is a great time to get your own Emma mattress. If you fancy it, hit the link in the description below. There is already a 30% sale on Emma's website right now, and you can get your own mattress for a heavily discounted amount. And if you want even more discount on us, why don't you use code Joey and Josh? If you do so, you'll get an additional 5% off. Thank you so much to Emma for sponsoring this video. Now let's get back into it. Yeah, fair enough. Right, so then let's get back to what he actually did. Joey has already said he was involved in the substance games. He was actually a smuggler, and this is why he was particularly interested in Neil's line of work, being import-export. He thought that he could get control of this company and use it for nefarious means.
I mean, it's a bit of a tap-in, really, isn't it?
Yeah.
It would be quite straightforward if he does have those connections.
Yep, exactly that. And before he was nicked, he was living very well. Like, he had a Cartier watch, he drove in a Merc, he went to expensive restaurants, he met very rich people. He was in the circles that you'd want to be in as a wealthy man at that sort of time, right? But the problem for him is that his lifestyle very much caught up with it. Because in 1998, the authorities actually found him in possession of 25 kilos of serious substances. That is a lot of substances, and they laid it on him hard, so much so that they said that they had all of the evidence that they needed to convict him, and he knew he was absolutely royally FC UK'd. So he was left with the possibility of having 20 plus years in prison, and the obvious thing that you would do under that level of stress is that he caved to the pressure, and he turned into a supergrass, so much so that he cooperated in 4 major police operations and even implicated his own mate. And that is a mate that you should remember the name of, because his name was William Horncy, and we'll get into William in a little bit of time. As a result, Regan's sentence was drastically, and we mean drastically, reduced. He was only given 8 years, which meant in the summer of 2002, just after 4 years of his full jail time that he was originally convicted with, Kenneth was released. And he went straight out, wanting to graft and get his lavish lifestyle back, which had completely disappeared at this point. So much so that he actually ended up in the bedroom of his dad's bungalow, living without all this cash, without all this lifestyle, without all this prestige that he had in a past life. And so he very, very much wanted to bring that lifestyle back and wanted to do it quickly. So he calls up his acquaintance that he met in prison, and that person was Neil, who kindly considered his job application because, as you know, Neil had been inside himself, and so he wanted to give something back to his mate, but also he wanted to give something back to people that had been in a similar position to him, knowing that they were good workers, knowing that this guy apparently was a decent guy, and he was more than happy to work in his business. And so, as we've said, he started working for Sabre Freight, which was the name of the rebranded company that Neil owned. The thing is that Kenneth never actually wanted to be a driver. He, in fact, never even wanted to be back on the straight and narrow. He wanted back in the game, and he saw himself as a complete kingpin. So Kenneth devised a plan. He knew that Neil had a young family, and that young family wanted to move back to India. And he used that as a point of weakness. He knew that Neil would be open to selling the company, and so he devised a plan. So he knew some random Netherlands-based businessmen that were interested in investing in the company, and he was the frontman for these guys. And they were so interested in Sabre Freight that they were willing to put £3 million in cash to acquire the business. And obviously, Neil being open to selling the business and open to moving back to India, he was very, very interested in this offer. It was a huge amount of cash and could basically mean he could retire for the rest of his life. Bearing in mind, this is what, 20 odd years ago at this point. £3 million is probably £6 million now. You could live very happily for the rest of your life. So Kenneth sets up a meeting with these investors with Neil, and that is on the February the 13th, 2003, and it took place in a very well-known location. It took place at Stonehenge.
Why Stonehenge is nowhere near where they were?
I actually have no idea why he even chose Stonehenge.
So hold on. Kenneth Regan has gone to Neil and said, this guy wants to buy the company, couple of £1 million. Instead of bringing him to the yard or meeting in a nice restaurant in London, I think you'd probably wine and dine someone if there was a couple of £1 million.
Business deal on the line, yeah. And also, you might think people flying in from the Netherlands might want a central location, might not want to travel too far away.
Not that many airports near Stonehenge that
There's
you're probably
not.
flying to.
There's not.
Weird. But regardless, Neil trusts Kenneth.
Yep.
Neil goes to Stonehenge. So Neil actually goes to work that morning, but after a couple of hours at the yard, he tells his workers that he's actually leaving and he's going now to sell the company. And once leaving, he gets in his car and he drives all the way to Stonehenge, where he believes he's going to be meeting Kenneth Regan and a Dutch businessman, but actually there is Kenneth Regan and an associate of his, Peter Rees. Now, it's very important to remember here, Peter Rees is posing as the Dutch businessman. I would love to know whether he put on an accent or anything like that.
Did the Steve McLaren, didn't he?
Bit of a Steve McLaren, I would imagine. Dutch businessman. Peter Rees is posing as him, and they've said that they need to go somewhere else. And that's actually at the point when Neil Chohan is bound, gagged and forced to take substances to subdue him. And all of this would happen before being moved to a house in which they would keep Neil, which was actually the house of Kenneth Regan's father. However, his father was actually elderly by this point and suffering with medical conditions, and therefore he didn't actually have any idea that Neil was even in his house. One man who did have an idea would be the third accomplice, another man who was very, very important to this case, and that is William Horncy. And as Josh said, William Horncy was a long-term criminal associate of Kenneth Regan's, but the interesting thing about this, which blew my mind, Josh, you spoke about the fact that Kenneth Regan became Supergrass. He was an informant, right? Do you know one of the people he informed on?
It was William Horncy, which I couldn't believe. So how has he managed to convince William Horncy to get involved in this plan? Surely, and I've seen this a million times in movies, Joey, and you tell me if this is true or not. There's basically a grass, he goes to prison. As soon as he gets out, he's in big trouble. He's got to avoid everyone that he once knew because those people knew what he did.
Yep.
Doesn't quite make sense then in this case because William Horncy's very, very buddy-buddy with Kenneth. So much so he gets fully involved.
But what does Kenneth have?
Go on.
Kenneth has Neil Chohan. Kenneth has the trust of Neil Chohan. So actually, what you're saying there about him grassing on William Horncy.
But how would you have any trust? How would you have any trust of Kenneth if you were William to say this guy isn't going to dob me in again or he's not going to screw me over?
Again, it's completely hypothetical and we would just be speculating really, but you would imagine maybe there would potentially be an element of fear involved there. I really don't know. And I also don't know too much about the power struggle between a Kenneth Regan and a William Horncy. I don't know whether they were seen as on the same level, as one was further ahead in the criminal world or whatnot, but both of them were very much so the two men that would be running the show now they had captured Neil Chohan. And this captivity went on for 4 days, where Neil was believed to have been tortured, while Kenneth and William forced Neil to sign over the company to them. They also forced Neil to sign multiple blank sheets in case they ever needed to forge documents for him, and they even forced him to record messages that they would play to his family, where he would explain not to worry and that he was just away on work. And Peter Rees, who I mentioned before, wasn't actually as involved once they were back at the house, but he was responsible for guarding Neil whenever the other two left. And after 3 days consecutively of being tortured and signing his life away, Neil Chohan must have understood that the chances of him leaving that property were probably very, very unlikely. And that is when he does something that will go down in the history books when it comes to true crime cases. He actually finds a letter addressed to Kenneth Regan on the floor in that house. He folds it up and he puts it inside of his sock. And he did so because he feared that Kenneth Regan and William Horncy were going to kill him. And unfortunately, that's exactly what they did. On February the 16th, they do take the life of Neil Chohan, but they never find the letter that's in his sock. But if you were thinking that this might be some sort of silver lining to the story, you would be very, very much wrong, because this is a case that the worst's very much still to come, and the worst actually happened just before they took Neil Chohan's life. Josh, why don't you tell me what they did once they realised that Neil Chohan's family would know exactly where he was?
Yeah, before we get into this, I just want to warn you that we are going to be talking about the murder of this family in cold blood. So just prepare yourselves for that. And again, we'll try and do this as sensitively as we actually can. Now, remember this. Not only had Neil told his business partner, who was called Mike Parr, and some of his staff at Seaboard Freight that he was going to this meeting, he also told his wife, Nancy. And as you can imagine, Nancy was very excited with the possibility that the company might be sold. She was incredibly excited to potentially move back to India to raise her young family back there. And so she was buzzing about this. She was wanting to know about the meeting. And Kenneth and William knew that. And so they immediately went back to the house in Hounslow and tried to find the family. And there, Nancy, her mother, Devinder and Ravinder, each 18 months and 8 weeks old, were murdered by Kenneth, Regan and William Horncy. And following this, they hired a van and transported the bodies to a place in the West Country. And you might be asking, what was in the West Country? We haven't really even brought up this part of the world in the episode so far. Well, Kenneth had a plan, and it wasn't something that he just made up on the spot. This was something that he'd been planning for quite some time. In 1997, before he was nicked, Kenneth met a woman called Belinda Brewin. She was a well-to-do woman with a good job, and Kenneth became absolutely obsessed with her. And by the time Kenneth was released, Belinda had moved to a small town called Tiverton in Devon. She had split from her partner and now had to try and support her 2 kids, mainly by herself, and pay for this huge house's mortgage. And by stroke of luck, Kenneth gets back in touch with her and offers her a huge salary and a potential way out of her awful financial situation, which she absolutely accepted. So Kenneth was effectively now her boss. So when he starts turning up at her house, she's kind of confused, but gets on with it. And Kenneth and his mates were suddenly turning up to that house quite often indeed. And they were doing a lot of work. They were getting outside in the fields, they were digging, they were bringing articulated digging gear to the actual property all of a sudden. And that's when we get back to February the 19th. Belinda was away from home, and Kenneth, William and Peter arrive at her property, and they bury the Chohan family in what they told her was a drainage ditch.
Yeah, and one of the things that I found scariest about this case is how easily it could have gone unsolved. Because, do you know, after Nancy, her mother, their kids, obviously Neil himself, had all vanished, right? A lot of people were just happy to accept the possibility that they are just up and left, gone back to India, not told anyone, not said any goodbyes, not sewn up loose ends, anything like that. A lot of people did genuinely believe that they could have just left.
Yeah, and the worst part of this is it kind of made sense, because they had been saying to their friends and family that they were really interested in moving back home. And so if an opportunity came up like this and the perfect situation had happened, they made all this money, £3 million potentially in cash from the investors, this would be a credible story, and it makes complete sense. So yeah, you can kind of understand why in the immediate term, at least the first couple of days, there would be no one else looking for them.
And it sounds awful to sort of use this word in this context, because it's like I'm using it in a light of praising, and I'm definitely not. But it really does show how clever the criminal operation was here. You know, the fact that this family could have theoretically just disappeared, and they did have plans to go. What I'm saying is, it looks a lot less opportunistic and more like a very, very carefully thought out plan here. And it was shown, the proof was in the pudding, because when they did vanish off of the face of the planet, some would say, hardly anyone really actually noticed until Neil's partner Nancy's brother starts to realise that something is not right. Because Nancy's brother Onka actually lived in New Zealand, and he'd been in constant contact with his sister. Obviously their mother was staying at that moment, and that meant that he was killing 2 birds with 1 stone. He would call the family home, he would speak to Nancy, and then he would speak to their mother together. And he actually had plans to fly to the UK just a few days after contact immediately dropped between himself and his family. So as you can imagine, poor Onka is speaking with his sister, he's speaking with his mum, they're making plans, and then all of a sudden, like that, everything stops. I can only begin to imagine how worried he must have been at that time.
And also, hadn't Nancy actually spoken to him and said, I'm particularly worried about this potential business meeting, I haven't heard from Neil for a while, and basically raised the alarm before anything more happened at that point.
She had. And there was another thing that she had raised suspicion at with her brother Onka, and that was the fact that we obviously spoke about Kenneth Regan forcing Neil into those voice recordings, those messages that he would then play to Nancy. And obviously what Kenneth Regan believed he was doing in that circumstance was he was giving his plan sort of solidarity. He was giving it
credibility.
A lot more credibility, right?
Yeah.
And the reason being why Nancy obviously found that suspicious is the fact that Neil Chohan and Nancy did not speak in English. So in these voice notes, Neil Chohan is speaking in English to Nancy, but for any reason, that wouldn't have happened. They didn't speak in English. They spoke the native tongue when they were in each other's company. And when they were in the company of anyone else from the part of India that they were from, they would speak in that language. So when she's getting relayed a message and it's Neil Chohan all of a sudden speaking in English, Kenneth Regan might not have realised, but that was a major red flag for Nancy. And because of all of this, Nancy's brother Onka obviously rung the police more or less immediately, but he said that the police really didn't take it seriously, and that meant that he would have to wait 5 more days until his flight was scheduled to take him to see the Chohan family. And when he arrived at the family home, he was shocked to see the state that it was in. Laundry had been left in the washing machine, toys and babies' bottles were all over the floor, no clothes or possessions had been taken, and obviously that would suggest that maybe they hadn't moved away. And Onkar and Nancy's mother actually had a holy book that was sacred to her. She wouldn't leave anywhere without that book. She wouldn't travel to anywhere without that book, and that book was sat inside Nancy Chohan's house. However, despite Onkar's persistence, the police would not treat it as a murder inquiry, instead insisting that the likelihood was that the family had simply flown back to India. And that meant for the next month or so, Onkar just had to pile the pressure on the police, while it kind of seemed like they weren't doing that much. And that would have been music to the ears of William Horncy and Kenneth Regan, who by this point were probably starting to feel like they had gotten away with what they perceived to be the perfect crime. But eventually police do start to up the intensity. They do start to check the phone records of Neil Chohan, and when they do that, that leads them all the way to Dorset. And obviously Kenneth Regan, William Horncy are looking at the news every day. They are keeping tabs on this case, and when Kenneth Regan decides that the police are getting a little bit too close for comfort, he decides to go back with Peter Rees and with Kenneth and with William Horncy, and they dig up all 5 bodies. They load the 5 bodies, they put the bodies in a boat, and they drive them out to the English Channel before dumping them one by one at sea. They were originally weighted down, they were put into a remote area, and the men probably thought that that would be the last they would ever see of the Chohan family.
Now, before we go into the discovery of Neil's body, let me just tell you a bit about the police's case at this point, because let's be honest, they didn't really have very much to go on at this point of the case, because well, they hadn't really been doing that much police work. It's time for a bit of police bashing, as you know we love to do in these episodes. Basically, they had gone down this theory that the family had fled and left the country and gone back to India. And so they were very happy with this case. They'd kept ignoring Onkar's warnings and ignoring everything that he was saying to them. And really, they weren't doing very much at this point. But what they did know is that Kenneth was the last person to see Neil. And so they obviously spoke to him. Kenneth makes out that Neil is some dodgy businessman wanting to sell his business, and he really lays it on thick. He basically said that he was in complete financial trouble, Neil was, by the way, and that he needed to sell the business. And again, as Joey has said, the police go through, they find the phone records, they know that they were together, but it was at this point that they received a phone call, and it was from Kenneth's associate, William Horncy. He was the man on the end of the line. He said to them that he had actually spoken to Neil and that he knew where he was and that he was going to be scheduling a meeting for them to go and chat with him. So at this point, the police were going to go and speak to Belinda, the woman that has this place out in the countryside, that has had all of these weird comings and goings in her private land, in her garden, effectively, the fields around her property. The police were literally on their way there. They turn around. They go, Neil's still alive. Potentially the family is still alive. So we need to go straight away and go to this meeting. And so they travel all the way to Newport in South Wales, another random location. They meet outside basically a statue of a pig, which could be have some other meaning about police work at this time. And basically William Horncy is there. He has another mate of his arrive, who is Kenneth. Again, probably should have raised some alarm bells. And the police are there staking them out. They're looking at the meeting, and the guys are agitated. They're looking at their phones. They're taking a phone call. And basically what they said is Neil had called them up. Something had come up. He said he was now on the run. He said a gang was involved, and they wouldn't be able to meet with them, but he was very much still alive. Now, the police are not stupid at this point. They know that this is something really dodgy, and they know that this isn't true. But they don't necessarily have the evidence to say that William or Kenneth were particularly involved anyway from this point. But what they do is they keep watching them. They very much keep them under surveillance. They try and get as much evidence as they can against them. But right now, they don't really have anything else to go on. And this is the point in which Neil's body is discovered. Basically, two kayakers went out to sea. They were in Bournemouth. Their names were Dave and his son, Carl Chapman. And it was on the 22nd of April, 2003. So you can see a decent amount of time has actually transpired between the point at which they go missing, which is in early February, and now. And yeah, as I said, it's a completely normal day. The boys are out kayaking, and they see this very sort of inflated body floating on the surface. They turn it around and they discover it to be Neil, and they have to wait for hours for the police and the authorities to actually show up, the Coast Guard to actually show up and help them. While they're doing that, they're actually in the sea in the dark. Yeah. So they're out there for a considerable amount of time.
That's a scary sort of image, isn't it? You're out in the sea at dark waiting with a dead body.
Yeah, absolutely ridiculous.
But as we know, we've already said that Neil Chohan puts the letter in his sock that in effect would lead the police to Kenneth Regan and William Horncy. But when Neil Chohan's body is taken by examiners, they take off his sock. They find the note. They don't deem it relevant, and therefore don't even look into the note or what is written on that note. Actually, for months. How mad is that?
Honestly, police bashing is entirely the phrase that we need to do right now. It's a disgrace that they didn't even look at it. The fact is, by the way, that this note had been so tightly folded that it had been relatively preserved, bearing in mind it had been in salt water for a considerable amount of time, submerged. You can imagine most pieces of paper would just completely disintegrate.
Well,
at this
mate,
point.
It's not a receipt in your wallet. You know, saying you're going to claim back some petrol on. It's a note in your sock. Yeah. Little newsflash, people don't really store stuff in their sock. No. Not unless they want to hide it. And if you're wanting to hide something, I don't know. I'm not a police investigator. Maybe it's relevant.
And also, if you're looking at a potential murder inquiry, by the way, maybe look at every single shred of evidence you possibly can. The fact this was discounted shows how awful this case actually was. And by the way, there's actually been some interviews with the sort of main officer involved. I can't believe he can show his face, bearing in mind he's missed so many different things here about this case.
And due to the fact that they did miss so much, due to the fact that Neil's body had been in the water for so long and therefore needed to be identified. So whether or not we understood and felt like it was Neil, the general public weren't able to have that confirmation. But in the general public was Kenneth Regan and William Horncy. And when they discovered that a body had washed up, they immediately went on the run. Police believed that they had departed the UK via a ferry, but their exact whereabouts was not yet known. Now, Peter Reed had also gone on the run after his part that he played, but he was tracked down just a couple of weeks later in Gloucestershire and arrested. But that meant that you still had Kenneth Regan and William Horncy on the run, as well as Nancy, her mother, and hers and Neil's two sons, all still missing. And before either man on the run could be tracked down, another gruesome discovery was set to emerge. Because on July the 15th, approximately 5 months after her disappearance, the body of Nancy Chohan washes up in the Poole Bay of Dorset. The body is actually found by 2 fishermen, and much like her husband Neil, the decomposition to the body is really, really extreme. And despite initially having hope that maybe they were still okay after the discovery of Neil Chohan's body, the police very much now believed that they were dealing with a case where everyone in the family had been harmed. And not long at all after Nancy Chohan's body is found, Kenneth Regan is finally detained by police. So Regan had initially travelled via ferry from the UK to France. He had then moved on to Spain, and while doing so, he had said to have been with William Horncy, but it's said that Kenneth Regan's money actually run out, and he eventually ended up in Belgium. He was actually staying just on a campsite in Belgium, and it's on that campsite where there was a local bar. That is exactly where Kenneth Regan was arrested, inside of a local bar on a Belgium campsite. Now, William Horncy was no longer with Kenneth Regan at this point, but on September the 11th, 2003, he walks in to a police station at Dover and hands himself in. Although I say handing himself in, he wasn't quite handing himself in. You see, William Horncy was still going with the spin that they had been blackmailed and were dealing with gangsters. And the police knew that this was a load of bollocks, but they had to keep William Horncy in until they could prove that. And while William Horncy is in custody, a third and final discovery is made. Because on the 16th of November 2003, the body of Charanjit Kaur washes up Nancy's mother that had been staying with them at that time, and it's actually discovered on the Isle of Wight. And this must have been such a horrific scene for those who discovered it, because it was on a local beach that her body washed up on. Now, obviously, we spoke about the level of decomposition that Neil's body had suffered, that his wife Nancy's body had suffered. This woman had been in the sea for about 10 months at this time. She eventually washes up onto a beach, and therefore you can only begin to imagine the sight that the people who discovered her must have been greeted by. It must have been horrific.
Yeah, it's absolutely disgusting. And again, it's just against the perpetrators here. They've done this, and they've not had to deal with the consequences of seeing this person. But unfortunately, in the trial, this was all detailed. You know, the jury had to see all of this. The family had to see all of this. So yeah, it's just absolutely despicable, to be honest.
Yeah, and you know, I said that they actually took quite a bit of time to be able to identify Amarjit's body, right? That was obviously under a couple of months. Do you know how long it actually took to identify Nancy's mother's body because of how long it had been in that water?
Wasn't it nearly a year?
It was a whole year before they could identify it.
It's just absolutely awful.
The worst thing
Yeah.
about this case, that I don't know whether the viewers that already knew about this story or not probably might not know, is the fact that the two infant sons, their bodies were obviously never found, never able to be laid to rest along with their parents, you know, properly how they would have wanted to. And it's just an awful, awful situation, isn't it?
Yeah, the fact that two young children were murdered is bad enough. The fact that they didn't, then the family weren't able to bury the bodies, is just absolutely disgusting. Absolutely awful.
So tragically, 3 bodies have now eventually washed up. They have 3 perpetrators that they believe to be responsible for the crime in custody. Josh, why don't you let me know what happened in this case next?
Yeah, so again, tragic events that we've even had to discuss, and unfortunately it's not necessarily going to get much better from here, because this trial was a very prolonged trial. In fact, it's pretty unique really in terms of the true crime cases that we've covered on this channel, and that's because all in, this investigation and this court case cost the British taxpayer over £10 million. That's because it lasted over 8 months, this trial, and it started in 2004, and the jury were presented with 4,500 pieces of evidence, things ranging from financial transactions and petrol receipts all the way to, as we've just had to describe, the gruesome discoveries that were found, photographs, that sort of thing, of the bodies. So you can imagine, not only was it incredibly traumatic for the jury, but also it's an incredible amount of time to actually have to sit through and listen to all of this. And of course, all of the perpetrators pled not guilty, which meant they had this full, long drawn out trial. So Kenneth Regan, William Horncy and Peter Rees were all charged with the murders of all 5 members of the Chohan family, as well as charges including kidnap, false imprisonment, perverting the course of justice, and preventing the lawful burial of a dead body. And the prosecution, as I say, laid out all of this evidence in great detail. And they built a case mainly on the forensic evidence, surveillance footage that the police were doing of the perpetrators, as well as the crucial piece of evidence that Joey has spoken about earlier on, which was that letter in Neil's sock. Eventually, when the police actually got round to even looking at this, it was found to be from a building society, and it was addressed to a certain Kenneth Regan, and it detailed his home address. This proved that Chohan was kept captive during this time and during the dates in question, because it actually had a date on it, so you could actually ascertain when this actually happened. They also showed all of the phone records that we've gone on to in this episode, and they were able to track the movements of the perpetrators and show that they were similar to that of Neil. And also the burial site of Belinda's property was actually looked into in great detail. This drainage ditch that the perpetrators actually said contained burnt clothing, items of jewelry, and strands of hair from the Chohan family. The police also managed to uncover blank pieces of paper, which we have said earlier on the perpetrators actually used to forge Neil's signature on, and they saw reels and reels of these pieces of paper, which again is super weird and unusual in any other circumstance. And with this forensic examination, the police also managed to find a single drop of blood. That drop of blood, unfortunately, belonged to the toddler Devinder, which again, you know, it's just going through this case, mate, it's just brutal. And you have to say, like, to find blood of a young child like that in that property, you know, is clear evidence, but it's just absolutely awful.
Yeah, agreed. It's horrible. But with all of this in mind, how are they possibly able to even come up with a defense?
Yeah, it's absolutely ridiculous they even managed to do this, right? But as you've seen, Kenneth and William were very adept at coming up with stories. So they came into the trial no differently. Kenneth had claimed that he was completely innocent and that Neil had voluntarily gone abroad to avoid what he described as complete financial ruin, effectively. He was still trying to get over the tax evasion charges, and by doing that, he had fallen into the grasps of a mysterious gang, and the gang were the ones that actually murdered the family. And the fact that he even thought that this was a realistic story, basically with no evidence, and the fact that he knew that was also super strange, but he still said it in court. Now, what about Peter Rees? Well, Peter Rees' defense, their plan was effectively to distance him from the plan itself. They said that Regan was a psychopath and a manipulative liar, and that basically Rees had gone along with the plan because he was scared of him, effectively. And while the defense was completely laughable, the amount of evidence was so vast that the judge actually took 5 weeks just to sum up everything that was presented to the jury. They then took 13 days to deliver the verdict, and when they did, it was damning. They found that Kenneth Regan and William Horncy were guilty of all 5 murders. They were sentenced to life imprisonment with a whole life order, meaning that they will never be released. Peter Rees was also found guilty of the murder of Neil and assisting an offender. He was cleared of the murders of the other 4 Chohan family members, but he was still sentenced to life with a minimum term of 23 years. In his sentencing remarks, Judge Sir Stephen Mitchell told Regan and Horncy, "Your crimes are uniquely terrible. The cold-blooded murders of an 8-week-old baby and an 18-month-old toddler provide a chilling insight into the utterly perverted standards by which you have lived your lives." And thankfully, Kenneth and William, because they got those whole life orders, they will never be able to be released. So this isn't a thing where we're talking about potential parole dates or that sort of thing. They are in prison for the rest of their lives, and thank God they are. And what I have to say, I've never been able to wrap my head around this case, right, is how the fact that Kenneth devised this wonderful plan in his own head, he thought it was watertight, he thought he could get away with it. I've never understood that. This feels so obvious to me that it would be see-through straight away. But you don't. You think he could have got away with this?
Yeah, I think that's like strange that we don't see eye to eye on this. Obviously, we research so many true crime cases, and the attention to detail, that I feel awful saying this, but almost like, you know, the in-situation management of it, right, and the planning and everything that has gone into this, I would say is close to 100 times more than some of the cases that we deal with.
Yeah.
I actually think that, although meticulous isn't the word you could use, because they were caught, they were very, very thorough. And I do believe what they did in this case was exhausted a lot of time looking at avenues of how they could be caught and things like this. So I think the fact that they were consistently trying to escape capture and escape, guilt in this case, definitely made them actually quite hard to catch. And I think that when you look at the case itself, if you actually look at it, if you take Onkar, Nancy's brother, out of the scenario, I'm not saying that the case wouldn't have been solved. I'm not saying that the bodies wouldn't have washed up. I'm not saying that the police would have never got to the bottom of it. But what I am saying is it becomes a lot less likely. And what you're then doing is you are very, very reliant on those bodies washing up.
Do you know what
I know it's a hypothetical world, but if those bodies weren't to wash up, mate, he would have got away with his plan.
Do you know what you're missing out on, though? I think the financial element of this story would always have come back to Kenneth. How did a man that was he just got out of prison, he'd lost all of his revenue, all of his money, he was living in a bungalow with his old man, how would that man have been implicated and able to purchase a business, put it in his name along with his associates, and be able to get away with that scot-free? Eventually, that would have come out. It just doesn't make sense. It doesn't. There's no way a man of that sort of financial backing would be able to have purchased that business, regardless of the situation that Neil was in. Neil wouldn't have sold that business for nothing. He would have wanted a decent amount of money for it.
Again, I'm not an expert on these sort of things. The thing that I would say here is the fact that obviously Neil was an Indian native. He had spoke about his desire in returning to India. Obviously going back, listen, we're not going back that long, but we are going back 20 years. And I do think that, tracking people and keeping tabs on people was a lot harder 20 years ago. Yeah. I'm not saying that I think that they would have gotten away with it. I'm saying that I think there's definitely a possibility that they would have gotten away with this crime had it not been. And listen, they did for quite a while, They
did. And I think, to be honest with you, that is purely down to police ineptitude rather than their own criminal masterminds. I think this is a classic case of someone believing that they're a criminal mastermind, doing all of the steps to think that they've come up with the perfect crime. But in reality, we know it was actually relatively simple. If the police had done their due diligence and their actual legwork that Onkar had wanted them to do almost immediately, perhaps this would have been solved a lot quicker. So I personally feel that this is a story of police ineptitude rather than criminal mastermind, in my opinion.
Yeah, I definitely agree with you on that one, mate. Obviously, this is a case that we've had suggested to us by a few of our members. It's a case that maybe we didn't know as well, but it's definitely a massively, massively interesting case. So we're hoping that you guys have enjoyed it. And even more so, we want to know what you want to see covered off of the channel next. Obviously, again, thoughts and condolences are with everyone that was involved in what can only be described as such a tragic, horrific situation. We hope we've done it justice.
Yeah, we really do. And again, we always hope that we treat these cases with sensitivity for the families and anyone associated with the victims. So we very much hope we did that. And we just want to say thank you so much to all of you for watching this episode. If you did enjoy watching it, please do give this video a like. It's very important for us to judge whether these cases are interesting and useful for you guys, and the likes very much do that. So if you did enjoy this case, please do give it a like. If you haven't subscribed to the channel, this would be a great time to do so. And if you want to become a member of the Jerry and Josh podcast, then all you have to do is hit the link in the description below. When you do, you will get access to every single one of these videos up to 48 hours before anyone else, which is a huge right in its own. And we will also this year be bringing back the live streams. You and I'm in my new place now. We can get involved in these live streams, and we very much look forward to chatting to all of you guys and the members on those little shows that we do together.
Yep. Yeah, 100%. So listen, thank you very, very much to all of you guys, especially those of you who are members of the channel and actually recommended this case for us to be covered. As we say, it's a tragic one. It really, really is such a deep and somewhat disturbing case, but definitely one that we know that our viewers will enjoy. Let us know in the comment section below what cases you would like to see covered, and a video that if you made it to the end of this one, you'll definitely be interested in, crimes that took place in a very similar area. Definitely watch the case of Levi Belfield, which is on screen now, and we will see you all in the next one.